"Don't leave me to freeze. I'll give you a warm bed every night," begged the desperate Apache woman. The winter wind cut sharply across the frozen plains, sending icy needles of air that made even the bravest shiver. Snow covered the ground like a thick white blanket, and the few trees that managed to survive the cold bent under the weight of ice. In the distance, the mountains stood dark and silent, their peaks hidden behind clouds heavy with more snow. In this lonely frozen world, a figure moved slowly, wrapped in thin layers that offered little protection. Her small frame hunched against the wind, each step a battle against both the snow and the biting cold. Ahuli, an Apache woman in her early 20s, had been walking for days. Her feet were raw and numb from the frozen ground, and her hands had long ago lost the ability to feel warmth. She had no companion, no home, and no promise of food. Her family had all been taken by disease, leaving her alone in a land that seemed determined to break her. Despite the hardship, she refused to give in to despair. She kept moving, one step after another, driven by a single thought: she had to survive. She had to find shelter. As she trudged through the snow, she thought about the times when her family had been with her. She remembered her mother's gentle voice, teaching her how to recognize edible plants even in the cold months, how to listen to the wind and understand when danger was near. She remembered her father, strong and steady, who had taught her to track animals and find water in places that seemed barren. Those memories, though painful, gave her strength. They reminded her that she was not entirely powerless. She had learned skills that could keep her alive, if she could find a safe place to rest. Hours passed, and the sun began to sink behind the distant mountains, leaving the land in a cold, gray half-light. Ahuli's stomach growled, a sharp reminder that hunger could be as dangerous as the freezing wind. She knew she needed to find a shelter soon. Her eyes scanned the landscape, searching for anything that could hide her from the wind and the eyes of anyone who might see her as a threat. Then, in the distance, she saw a small flicker, a thin line of smoke rising into the sky. Hope surged in her chest. Perhaps someone was there. Perhaps she could find warmth, food, or at least a safe place to spend the night. She moved carefully toward the smoke, keeping low and using the small dips in the snow-covered ground to hide her movements. As she got closer, she saw the shape of a cabin. It was small and simple, made of logs that had been stacked with care. Smoke curled from a chimney, and the smell of burning wood reached her nose. Her heart leapt. She had not felt the promise of warmth like this in weeks, yet caution still kept her steps slow. The world had been cruel to her, and she could not risk showing herself too soon. Inside the cabin, a man sat near a small fire. His clothes were worn, and his hands were rough and calloused. He looked as tired as the land outside, but the fire offered him comfort. This man, Daniel, had been traveling for weeks, searching for work and a safe place to rest. He had been a soldier once, but the war had left him weary and wary of strangers. He was used to relying only on himself, trusting no one because the world had taught him that trust could be dangerous. Ahuli paused at the edge of the clearing, unsure if she should approach. She had never been afraid of humans before, but hunger and desperation made her careful. If she made a mistake, she could be driven away, or worse. Still, the thought of freezing through another night made her courage swell. She stepped forward, her voice small but steady. "Please, I beg you, don't leave me to freeze. I will give you a warm bed every night if you let me stay." Daniel's head snapped up. He was startled by the sudden voice, and he instinctively reached for the small knife he kept near the fire. His eyes searched the edge of the clearing, and finally, he saw her. A young woman, thin and shivering, her hair dusted with snow, looking at him with pleading eyes. Something about her gaze was different from the usual travelers or thieves he had encountered. There was honesty in her fear, a raw desperation that mirrored his own feelings from long ago when he had been lost and alone. He studied her for a moment, trying to read her intentions. His mind was filled with warnings from past experiences. Never trust a stranger. Survival comes first. The world is cruel. But there was another voice, quieter and gentler, whispering that perhaps this woman was just like him, lost, cold, and needing help. Ahuli noticed his hesitation. She stepped forward a little more, her teeth chattering. "Please, I will not trouble you. I only need a place to rest, just for tonight. I can help with the fire, with food. Anything you need? I only want to survive." Daniel studied her words and saw no hint of trickery. He saw only the truth of someone who was vulnerable, someone who had nowhere else to turn. His mind wrestled with caution and compassion. Finally, he sighed and gestured toward the cabin. "All right, come in. But you stay near the fire, and you don't touch anything without asking." Ahuli's eyes lit up with relief. She hurried inside, careful not to slip on the icy steps. The warmth of the fire hit her immediately, seeping into her frozen body and bringing tears to her eyes. She could not remember the last time she had felt anything like this. Her lips trembled, and she whispered a quiet thanks. Daniel did not respond. He was watching her carefully, still unsure if he could fully trust this stranger in his home. As she warmed herself, Ahuli offered to help with chores. She stoked the fire, fetched water from a small basin, and began to prepare a simple meal. Daniel observed silently, noting her care and skill. There was something remarkable about her determination. She had survived alone in the wild, and now she was using her knowledge to make his cabin a little warmer, a little safer. He felt a twinge of respect for her resilience. Night fell outside, and the wind howled against the cabin walls. Ahuli sat near the fire, her eyes fixed on Daniel as he cleaned his weapons. She wanted to speak, to share her story, but the words felt heavy on her tongue. Instead, she focused on the small tasks that kept the cabin running. Daniel, sensing her unease, finally spoke in a low voice. "You've been out there alone?" Ahuli nodded. "Yes, for many days. My family, they are gone. The snow, the cold, I have nothing left but myself." Her voice cracked, but she held herself steady. "I cannot survive another night outside." Daniel's expression softened. He remembered the long nights he had spent alone, hungry and afraid. He knew the weight of loneliness and the sharp edge of fear. He said nothing at first, letting the fire and the silence speak for them. Then he nodded. "You'll stay tonight. We'll see about tomorrow when it comes. But for now, sit by the fire. You're safe." Ahuli sank into a small chair near the flames, feeling a warmth she had not felt in weeks. Her hands no longer shook as violently, and she could feel life slowly returning to her frozen fingers. For the first time since she had wandered into the snowy plains, she allowed herself a small sigh of relief. She was not alone. Not yet. Outside, the wind continued to rage, but inside the cabin, there was a fragile sense of peace. Two strangers, brought together by chance and desperation, shared the small warmth of a fire. They did not speak much that night, but the quiet companionship was enough. In that moment, Ahuli understood that survival was not only about food or shelter. It was about finding someone who could see you, really see you, and still offer kindness. As she drifted toward sleep, she whispered softly to herself, "Tomorrow, maybe tomorrow I will find hope." And for the first time in many days, that hope did not feel like a lie. Morning came slowly, painting the snowy plains with pale gold light. Through the small window of the cabin, Ahuli could see the sun struggling to rise over the frozen mountains. The world outside was still white and cold, but inside, the fire crackled, bringing warmth to her chilled bones. She stretched carefully, feeling the comfort of the cabin around her, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a small sense of hope. Daniel had been up before her, tending the fire and checking his supplies. The cabin was small, but it was well kept. There were a few shelves holding dried foods, a small pile of firewood stacked neatly, and a simple bed in the corner. He moved quietly, not wanting to wake her, yet he kept a careful watch outside as well. His years of survival had taught him that danger could appear when least expected, and he trusted no one who had spent the night in his cabin. Ahuli stirred, pulling her thin blanket tighter around her shoulders. Her stomach ached with hunger, reminding her that she had not eaten well for days. Yet the fear of rejection lingered in her mind. She had begged for shelter the night before, but she still did not know if Daniel truly trusted her. Her people had taught her that trust was earned, not given, and she knew she must show that she could be useful if she was to survive. She moved to the small hearth and began arranging the firewood, adding a few small sticks to keep the flames strong. She worked silently, careful not to interrupt Daniel. After a moment, he spoke in a low voice. "You're up early." His tone was cautious, almost testing her. Ahuli nodded. "I sleep lightly. The cold, it makes me restless. I want to help with the fire before it dies." She kept her voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly from cold and nervousness. Daniel studied her. There was something in her eyes, an alertness, a determination, that reminded him of his younger self. He had wandered alone for weeks, relying only on himself. Now, seeing Ahuli, he realized that she might not just need his help, he might need hers as well. Without saying a word, he handed her a small basket of dried meat and berries. "Eat," he said. "You'll need strength if you want to keep up." Ahuli's face brightened. She had not eaten properly in days. Carefully, she picked at the dried meat, savoring every small bite. The simple meal filled her stomach, but it did more than that. It gave her courage. For the first time since she had been alone, she felt she could face the day. "After eating," she asked quietly, "I can help you. Tell me what to do. I can fetch water, help with the fire, or even find food outside if you want." Her voice carried a quiet confidence, and she met Daniel's eyes, hoping he would see her sincerity. Daniel considered her offer. His mind was cautious, reminding him of the dangers of trusting strangers. Yet he also knew that he could not survive the long winter alone without someone to share the burden. Slowly, he nodded.
"All right, you can help."
"But you follow my instructions. No wandering off, no taking risks you're not ready for." "Ah," Huli smiled faintly. "I understand." "I will do my best." As the morning passed, they settled into a quiet routine. Ahuli helped with small chores around the cabin, tending the fire, filling the water basin, and preparing the sparse food they had. Daniel, in turn, shared some of his knowledge of survival. He showed her how to preserve food for longer periods, how to check the ice before attempting to cross frozen streams, and how to stay alert for danger. Despite the simplicity of the tasks, both found themselves learning from each other. Ahuli taught Daniel how to recognize subtle tracks in the snow, small signs that indicated whether animals or humans had passed nearby. She showed him which plants could be used for tea to warm the body and which herbs could soothe minor aches. Daniel, who had relied on rigid routines and military discipline, began to appreciate her quiet wisdom and intuition. By midday, the cabin felt warmer, both from the fire and from the growing bond between them. Ahuli and Daniel worked side by side, speaking little, but understanding much through gestures and shared effort. Occasionally, Ahuli would glance at Daniel, noting the lines of worry on his face and the tension in his shoulders. She realized that, like her, he had endured loss and hardship, and that survival had forced him to be cautious with his trust. That afternoon, they heard a distant sound, a crunch of snow, and the faint noise of movement. Both froze, eyes locking on the door. Daniel reached for his knife, while Ahuli instinctively moved closer to the warmth of the fire. Moments later, a small fox appeared outside, its fur bright against the white snow. Ahuli's tension eased, and she smiled quietly. "Even the smallest creatures fight to survive," she said softly. Daniel nodded, lowering his knife. "Yes. And sometimes we have to help each other to survive as well." The sun dipped below the mountains, and darkness wrapped the world in cold shadows. Ahuli sat near the fire, her hands stretched toward the flames, while Daniel prepared a simple meal from dried meat and roots he had gathered earlier. The warmth of the fire, combined with the comfort of having someone near, made the cabin feel less like a shelter and more like a home. As they ate, Ahuli spoke about her past, carefully choosing her words. She told Daniel about her family, the lessons her parents had taught her, and the hardships she had endured. She spoke not to complain, but to share her story. her way of building trust. Daniel listened quietly, occasionally nodding, sometimes asking questions. He did not share much of his past yet, but in listening to her, he felt a connection he had not experienced in years. Night fell and the wind outside grew stronger. Ahuli wrapped herself in a blanket, but she stayed near the fire, unwilling to retreat completely. Daniel noticed her vigilance and said quietly, "You're brave to face this cold alone. Most people would have given up long ago." Ahuli looked at him and smiled faintly. "Bravery is sometimes the only choice we have. If we stop moving, we freeze, not just our bodies, but our minds." "I cannot give up." Daniel considered her words. He realized that her strength was not just physical. It was her spirit that kept her alive. He had spent years relying on discipline and survival skills, but Ahuli showed him that courage and hope could be just as powerful. By the time the fire burned low, they had settled into an uneasy comfort. Ahuli had earned Daniel's trust, but he remained cautious. Still, a quiet understanding had formed between them, a promise that each would help the other, at least for tonight. And in that small cabin surrounded by snow and wind, two lost souls began to find warmth and companionship. As Ahuli lay on the small blanket Daniel had offered, she whispered to herself, "Tomorrow, I will help him even more. I will prove that kindness can survive even in the coldest winter." Daniel, sitting near the dying fire, thought quietly about her words. He realized that survival was no longer only about staying alive. It was about finding someone to share that life with, someone who could bring warmth to both body and heart. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside the cabin there was quiet determination, trust, and the faintest flicker of hope. Both Ahuli and Daniel understood that the days ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in a long time, neither of them felt completely alone. They had found in each other not just shelter, but a reason to keep moving forward, no matter what the frozen world outside might throw at them. And as the first snow of evening settled gently on the cabin roof, both of them drifted into a quiet sleep, hearts lighter than they had been in weeks, ready to face whatever the next day might bring. The next morning arrived cold and gray, with clouds heavy in the sky and a wind that cut sharply across the plains. Ahuli woke early, her eyes scanning the horizon from the small window of the cabin. She had slept better than she had in weeks, and the warmth of the fire from the night before still lingered in her bones. Yet, as she watched the swirling snow outside, a knot of unease formed in her stomach. Something felt different this morning. Daniel was already awake, tending the fire, and moving quietly around the cabin. He had not yet spoken, but his eyes flicked toward the window several times, watching the woods beyond. Ahuli noticed the tension in his movements and understood that he was worried about something. "Is something wrong?" she asked softly, breaking the silence. Daniel paused and glanced at her. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "I've been seeing tracks near the edge of the trees. Strangers, maybe hunters. They might be passing through or they might be looking for shelter themselves. Either way, we have to be careful." Ahuli nodded. She understood the danger immediately. In her life, she had learned to read the land and recognize signs of others. The tracks were fresh, and the snow was soft enough to leave clear marks. "They're not far," she said quietly. "If we are not careful, they could find us." Daniel considered her words. The cabin had felt safe for the past 2 days, but now that sense of security seemed fragile. "We may have to move," he said, "or at least be ready to defend ourselves." Ahuli did not flinch. Years of survival had taught her to face danger without panic. "I can help," she said firmly. "I know ways to hide, to protect ourselves. We can be ready before they reach us." They spent the morning preparing. Daniel checked the small weapons he kept, knives and a rifle, and made sure everything was in working order. Ahuli went outside carefully, studying the tracks marking where the strangers might be coming from, and identifying places they could hide if needed. Together, they created a plan, moving with quiet efficiency. There was a rhythm to their actions, a silent understanding growing between them. By midday, the sky had darkened, and the wind had grown stronger. Snow swirled around the cabin in small flurries, covering their footprints and making the landscape even more treacherous. Ahuli and Daniel stayed near the fire, but both remained alert, listening for the faintest sound of movement outside. Hours passed slowly, each one filled with quiet tension. Finally, in the late afternoon, they heard it, a distant crunching in the snow, heavier than a fox or deer, more deliberate, more human. Daniel immediately moved toward the window, peering out with narrowed eyes. Ahuli crouched nearby, ready to help if needed. In the distance, two figures were approaching, cloaked in winter coats, carrying small packs. Their movements were careful, but their presence was clear. Daniel whispered, "They've seen the cabin. We have little time." Ahuli's mind raced. She thought of the lessons her parents had taught her, how to remain calm in danger, how to use the land to your advantage. "We should hide," she said. "They will not look carefully if they think no one is home. We can watch them, and if they get too close, we can move." They quickly moved supplies and prepared the cabin to appear empty. Daniel opened the door slightly, peering out, while Ahuli crouched near the fire ready to react. The two strangers came closer, stepping carefully through the snow. But neither seemed aware of the hidden presence inside. Ahuli held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt the cold more sharply now as adrenaline raced through her body. Survival had become more than just enduring the cold. It was now a test of skill, courage, and trust. Suddenly, one of the strangers paused, looking around suspiciously. Ahuli tensed, ready to act, but Daniel placed a hand on her arm, signaling patience. They waited silently, letting the snow and wind cover their movements. After a few tense moments, the strangers moved past the cabin, unaware of the people watching them. Ahuli exhaled slowly, relief washing over her, but the tension did not completely fade. "They may come back," Daniel said quietly. "We need to be ready." "I can help make traps," she said. "Simple ones to warn us if they return. And I can watch from the trees. My eyes are used to looking for movement." The day continued, each hour filled with quiet preparation. Daniel and Ahuli worked side by side, creating small barriers and traps around the cabin. They took turns keeping watch, scanning the snow-covered plains for any sign of danger. The bond between them grew stronger with every shared task. They communicated with gestures, short words, and silent understanding. Both recognized that survival depended not just on skill, but on trust. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the snow, Ahuli ventured a small step closer to Daniel. "Do you trust me?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above the crackling fire. Daniel looked at her, studying her face. He saw determination, courage, and honesty. Slowly he nodded. "I do. But trust doesn't mean we are safe. It only means we face danger together." Ahuli smiled faintly. "That is enough." Night came quickly, the wind howling and snow drifting across the plains. Ahuli and Daniel kept their routine, taking turns by the fire and at the window, watching for signs of the strangers. The cold was relentless, but inside the cabin there was warmth, both from the fire and from the companionship they shared. They had begun as strangers, brought together by need and desperation. But now they were partners in survival, relying on each other in ways neither had anticipated. During a brief lull, Ahuli spoke softly. "When I was younger, my parents taught me that the land can be both friend and enemy. It can provide warmth and food, but it can also test you in ways you do not expect. Today, we have faced that test." Daniel nodded, understanding more than words could express. He had spent much of his life relying on himself, trusting no one, and yet here he was, learning that strength could also come from partnership. "And we passed it," he said quietly. Ahuli smiled faintly, but her eyes were serious. "Yes, for now. But we must be ready. The world outside is not safe, and there will always be challenges." They settled near the fire as the night deepened, listening to the wind and snow. The strangers had not returned, but both knew that vigilance was essential. Ahuli, wrapped in her thin blanket, felt the weight of the day, yet also a growing sense of confidence. She had survived alone before, but now with Daniel, she realized that survival could be shared, that trust and cooperation could be as powerful as skill and courage. Daniel, sitting across from her, felt a quiet relief. He had lived through years of hardship and war, relying on himself alone, but now he saw that human connection could bring strength that solitude never could. He looked at Ahuli and saw not just a survivor, but a teacher, a companion, and perhaps, in time, a friend he could trust completely. The wind outside continued its relentless song, but inside the cabin there was a fragile peace. Two people, strangers brought together by the harsh winter, had begun to build a small fortress of warmth, trust, and hope. They knew the world beyond the cabin was dangerous, but for tonight, they had found safety in each other. As Ahuli drifted toward sleep, she whispered quietly to herself, "We will survive together." Daniel, watching the fire, thought the same, silently acknowledging that the bond they had formed was stronger than any storm, stronger than any danger outside. And so, in the cold and snow of the winter plains, two lost souls found not only safety, but a reason to keep moving forward. They had faced the first test of danger together, and they knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would meet them as partners, relying on skill, courage, and the fragile growing trust that had begun to form between them. The morning light crept slowly over the snow-covered plains, softening the harsh edges of the frozen world outside. Inside the small cabin, Ahuli stirred, stretching her tired muscles and breathing in the warmth that had become her lifeline. The fire from the night before still glowed faintly in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. For the first time in many weeks, she felt more than just the temporary relief of surviving a night. She felt the quiet comfort of having someone by her side. Daniel had already risen, moving quietly around the cabin as he prepared a small fire. His movements were methodical, almost automatic, but there was something different about this morning. He did not seem as tense as before. There was a faint softness in the way he looked at Ahuli. Over the past days, he had seen her resilience, her skill, and her courage. He had also felt the weight of her presence, a steady, calming force in a world that had offered him little trust or comfort. Ahuli watched him for a moment before speaking softly. "I want to help more," she said. "I can gather food outside if the snow is not too deep, or I can check the traps we made yesterday." Her voice carried determination, a subtle challenge to herself as much as to him. Daniel studied her, then nodded slowly. "All right, but we go together this time. The snow is deep, and the cold can be dangerous if we are not careful. I want to make sure you are safe." Together, they stepped outside. The cold struck them immediately, biting through layers of clothing and making their breath visible in the air. The snow crunched under their boots as they moved toward the small traps Ahuli had set the day before. She showed Daniel how she had arranged them to catch small animals and alert them if anyone approached the cabin. Each trap was simple, made with sticks and twine, but carefully planned. "Impressive," Daniel said quietly, watching her work. "You've thought of everything." Ahuli smiled faintly, though her cheeks were pink from the cold. "I've had to survive in harsher conditions than this. Planning and observation are the only ways to stay alive."
They checked the traps, finding one with the small rabbit caught.
Carefully, Ahuli untangled it and secured it, explaining how they could prepare it for food. Daniel listened attentively, realizing how much knowledge she carried from her people, knowledge that had kept her alive for so long. Her skills complemented his own survival techniques, creating a partnership neither had expected. As they prepared the small meal, Ahuli spoke of the lessons her parents had taught her: how to track animals, find edible plants, and read the weather. Daniel shared his experiences as a soldier, teaching her how to stay alert and how to protect themselves if someone approached. Though their methods were different, they respected each other's knowledge and worked together, slowly weaving trust into the fabric of their shared survival. By midday, they returned to the cabin, their arms full of small provisions. The wind had picked up outside, making the world seem even more hostile. But inside the cabin, there was a growing sense of comfort. Ahuli tended the fire while Daniel helped prepare the meal. There was a rhythm to their actions, a silent understanding that had developed over the past days. After eating, Ahuli moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered plains. "It is dangerous out there," she said softly. "But it is also beautiful. The land can give life if we know how to use it." Daniel nodded, feeling a sense of peace he had not known in years. "You have taught me that," he said. "I have survived alone for so long, but I did not realize how much strength comes from trust and companionship." Ahuli turned to him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "We have both survived alone, but together we can do more. We can be stronger, safer, and even find moments of happiness despite the cold." Daniel looked away for a moment, his mind recalling the long winters he had endured alone. The cold had always been easier to bear than loneliness, yet now he realized that sharing the struggle made it less painful and more meaningful. He met Ahuli's gaze and nodded. "You are right," he said quietly. "I am beginning to understand that." Ahuli repaired some of the cabin walls where the wind had blown snow inside, while Daniel cut more firewood to keep the hearth warm through the long night. They spoke little, but their shared effort built a deeper connection. Every small act, carrying wood, preparing food, tending the fire, became a thread weaving them closer together, forming a bond that neither had anticipated but both quietly relied upon. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Ahuli paused and looked at Daniel. "You do not have to carry all the weight yourself," she said softly. "Let me help. Let me share this burden with you." Daniel studied her words. For years he had relied on his own strength alone, believing that sharing his struggles would make him vulnerable. But now he saw the wisdom in her offer. He realized that accepting help did not mean weakness. It meant survival and trust. Slowly he nodded. "You are right," he admitted. "I cannot do this alone anymore." That evening, as the wind howled outside, they sat near the fire together. Ahuli had prepared a small bed for Daniel to rest, and in turn he had cleared a space for her to warm herself. They spoke quietly about their hopes for the future, about surviving the harsh winter, and about the possibility of finding more comfort in the world beyond the snow. Their words were simple, but they carried weight. Words of trust, encouragement, and companionship that had grown from shared struggle. Ahuli watched the fire, feeling a warmth that had little to do with the flames. She thought about the kindness Daniel had shown, the protection he offered, and the trust he had begun to place in her. She realized that the offer she had made days ago, to give him a warm bed and care for him, had been more than survival. It was the start of something deeper, a partnership built on respect, trust, and shared humanity. Daniel, sitting across from her, felt the same. He had lived a life of caution and self-reliance, but now he understood that survival was not just about enduring hardships alone. It was about forming bonds that could give strength and hope in the face of danger. Ahuli had shown him that kindness and courage could coexist, and that sharing the burden of life made the cold and the fear easier to bear. As night fell, the wind outside intensified, and snowflakes tapped against the cabin walls. Inside, however, there was warmth and light. Ahuli and Daniel shared a quiet meal and then settled near the fire. Ahuli stretched out on the small blanket, while Daniel kept watch at the window for a time before joining her. They spoke little, content with the presence of one another. The silence was not empty. It was full of trust, understanding, and the quiet knowledge that they had each found someone they could rely upon. Before sleep claimed them, Ahuli whispered softly, "I will do everything I can to keep us safe and warm. You do not have to face the cold alone." Daniel reached over, resting a hand briefly on hers, a gesture of quiet acknowledgement. "And I will do the same for you," he said. "We face this together." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, there was peace. Two people, once strangers, had found a fragile but powerful connection. They had learned to trust each other, to share the burden of survival, and to find warmth in companionship. The harsh world outside could test them, but they had discovered that together they could endure more than they had ever imagined. And as the fire burned low and the snow continued to fall, both Ahuli and Daniel drifted into sleep, comforted not only by the warmth of the cabin but by the growing bond between them, a bond built on shared hardships, mutual respect, and the quiet gift of compassion. The next morning the cabin felt warmer than ever, not just from the fire but from the sense of companionship that had grown between Ahuli and Daniel. The winter outside was harsh, as if testing their resolve, but inside there was hope. The snow-covered plains stretched endlessly, white and quiet, yet the two of them no longer felt alone. Together they had survived the dangers of the cold, the loneliness, and the threat of strangers. Now the days ahead seemed possible to face. Ahuli rose early, as she always did, and moved toward the small hearth. She added more firewood, careful to keep the flames strong enough to push back the cold. Daniel stirred from his rest, watching her quietly. He admired the way she moved, deliberate, careful, yet with a confidence that seemed to come from deep experience. She had endured so much, yet she radiated calm strength. "I will fetch water today," Ahuli said softly. "The stream nearby is not frozen yet. If we collect more water now, we will not need to risk going out in the storm later." Daniel nodded, knowing she was right. "Be careful," he warned. "I'll come with you to make sure no one surprises us." Together, they stepped into the crisp morning air. Snow crunched beneath their boots, and each breath formed clouds of steam. The wind whipped against them, but they moved steadily toward the stream, watching for footprints or any sign of danger. Ahuli led the way, her eyes sharp and alert, noticing details in the snow that Daniel might have missed. A broken branch here, a displaced snowdrift there. Small signs that the world around them was alive and needed careful attention. When they reached the stream, they worked together to gather water and melt some snow for extra supplies. Ahuli spoke quietly as she worked, teaching Daniel small tricks she had learned from her people: how to find the cleanest water, how to recognize hidden ice, and how to avoid dangerous spots. Daniel listened carefully, appreciating the wisdom she shared. Her knowledge of the land was remarkable, and it reminded him that survival was not just about strength, but also about understanding and respect. After returning to the cabin, they rested briefly before preparing a meal. The warmth of the fire and the sound of the crackling wood seemed to fill the cabin with comfort. Ahuli tended the food, while Daniel cut more firewood and checked the cabin walls for any weak spots where the wind might creep in. They worked silently, but every small act was a conversation of trust and care. As the afternoon wore on, they sat near the fire, sharing a quiet moment. Ahuli spoke softly about her past, not the hardships, but the lessons she had learned: how to survive alone, how to keep hope alive, and how to recognize kindness in strangers. Daniel shared his own thoughts, speaking about the long years of solitude and how difficult it had been to trust anyone. Both recognized that their experiences, though different, had shaped them in similar ways. "I used to think survival meant relying only on myself," Daniel said quietly. "But now I understand that sometimes strength comes from trusting others, from sharing the burden of doubt." Ahuli nodded, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "Yes, survival is more than keeping the body alive. It is about finding warmth in the heart. And you have given me that warmth as well." The words hung between them, simple but profound. Outside the wind howled, but inside there was a fragile peace, a feeling of safety and hope that neither had known for a long time. They had faced danger, cold, and loneliness together, and through it all a bond had formed that was stronger than fear or hardship. As night approached, Ahuli prepared a small bed for Daniel near the fire, while she stretched out on her own blanket nearby. They shared a quiet meal, speaking little, content with the presence of each other. The cabin was small, but it felt larger than ever, because it was filled with trust, respect, and the quiet strength of companionship. After dinner, Daniel spoke quietly, almost as if thinking aloud. "Do you think we can survive the rest of the winter like this?" Ahuli smiled faintly, her eyes shining with determination. "We can, because we are not alone anymore. We have each other, and when the storm is too strong, we will face it together." The wind outside grew stronger, snow drifting against the cabin walls. Yet neither of them felt fear. They knew that life outside was unpredictable and harsh, but inside, they had found a sanctuary, a place where survival was possible, not just through food and shelter, but through trust, care, and companionship. That night, as the fire burned low, Ahuli and Daniel sat quietly, reflecting on the journey that had brought them together. They had begun as strangers, each wary, each cautious, but the cold, the danger, and the need to survive had brought them together. They had learned to rely on one another, to share responsibilities, and to find strength in partnership. Ahuli's thoughts drifted to the past, the loss of her family, the long days spent wandering alone, the fear that had been her constant companion. And now, despite all that hardship, she felt hope. She had found someone who saw her not just as a desperate woman in need, but as a capable, strong, and wise person. Daniel had become more than a companion. He had become a friend, someone she could trust completely. Daniel, in turn, reflected on his life of solitude and caution. He had spent years relying only on himself, believing that trust could bring danger. But through Ahuli, he had learned that kindness and trust were not weaknesses. They were strengths. She had shown him that survival was more than enduring hardships. It was about sharing them, learning from each other, and finding comfort in companionship. As they settled near the fire for sleep, Ahuli whispered softly, "Tomorrow will be another day, another challenge. But we will face it together." Daniel reached over, placing a hand briefly on hers, a small gesture that spoke volumes. "Together," he agreed. The night passed quietly, the storm outside seeming to respect the warmth within the cabin. Two people, once strangers, had formed a bond that carried them through the cold, the fear, and the uncertainty. They had found not only safety, but hope. And in that small, fragile hope, they discovered a simple truth. Survival was not just about enduring the world, it was about finding someone to share it with. The days that followed continued in a routine of work and preparation, but each day also brought small moments of connection and understanding. Ahuli and Daniel shared the tasks of survival, yet they also shared stories, laughter, and quiet companionship. Each day strengthened their trust, teaching them that the world could be harsh, but it could also offer warmth in unexpected places. Eventually, they realized that the harsh winter no longer seemed insurmountable. With a fire burning brightly and their supplies carefully managed, they had created a small refuge in the cold wilderness. Their bond had transformed the cabin from a place of mere survival into a home where each felt valued, seen, and protected. Ahuli often reminded Daniel gently, "We may be strangers in this land, but together we are stronger than the winter, stronger than fear, stronger than loneliness." Daniel, once a man who had trusted no one, could only nod, feeling a sense of peace he had not known in years. He had discovered that trust, when given and received wisely, could create warmth that no fire alone could provide. As the final weeks of winter approached, Ahuli and Daniel faced fewer dangers from the outside world. The strangers who had passed near the cabin never returned, and the snow, though still cold and relentless, became a backdrop to their growing sense of security. Inside the cabin, the warmth of companionship and shared effort had created a sanctuary. One evening, as the sun set behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Ahuli and Daniel sat near the fire, sharing a simple meal. They spoke quietly, reflecting on the journey that had brought them together, the hardships they had endured, and the lessons they had learned. Their conversation was calm, filled with gratitude and understanding, yet it carried a deep truth. They had survived because they had found each other. Ahuli looked at Daniel and smiled. "I promised that I would give you warmth every night, and I will. But more than that, I have learned that warmth comes not only from fire, it comes from trust, companionship, and kindness. And you have given me that as well." Daniel met her gaze, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "And you have given me courage, hope, and friendship. We have survived the cold, But we have also found something more valuable than mere survival. We have found each other. The wind blew outside, snow drifting gently across the plains. But inside the cabin, there was peace. Two lives, once lonely and desperate, had become intertwined. They had faced danger, cold, and uncertainty, yet they had emerged stronger, not just because of their survival skills, but because of the trust, kindness, and compassion they had shared. And as night fell, they settled near the fire, hearts light with hope, ready to face the future together. In the small cabin amidst the harsh winter, they had found warmth, not only in blankets and fire, but in the bond they had formed, a bond that would carry them through the coldest nights and the hardest days. They had begun as strangers brought together by need and desperation, but they had survived, grown, and discovered that in the darkest winters, the human heart could provide warmth greater than any fire. And with that quiet understanding, they drifted into sleep, knowing that whatever the world outside might bring, they would face it together, stronger, braver, and warmer than they had ever been alone.